My name is Tanya Ravn Ag, and my paper is titled Art and the Broken Mirror, a Technogenetic Perspective on Digitally Expanding Realities. My paper is motivated by a concern with how current technologically produced expansions of so-called realities, what I refer to as digital expanded reality, affect deeper human relations to what we experience as real. So what I refer to as digital expanded reality are experiences involved with what we take for reality, what we accept it to be, what it feels like, how it is structured, and which opportunities we are granted by it. My guiding question here is, how can we understand art's participation in expanding our realities? So my inquiry concerns perceptual and interperceptual aspects of art's experience, especially the perceptual implications of the so-called new realities that we currently invent and solicit with technology, AR, VR, MR, and so forth, and which art explores. The analytical, critical attention to these digitally expanded realities is oftentimes pointed towards what they represent, as well as to their qualities of immersion, interactivity, feedback, abstraction, or narrative. But I'm interested in these experiences in art and beyond as part of a greater and, in a sense, much more daunting narrative. And this narrative evolves around the premise that our conditions for experiencing are changing. It might be argued that human perception is conditioned in such a way today that we to a lesser degree register an objective state of things, that is, if things could ever be understood to be objective in the first place. There seems to be a tendency in our time by which what is real seems to be up for negotiation. Phenomena like filter bubbles and fake news pay witness to a worrying horizon of competition for what we perceive to be reality, which expands with digital technology. And with industrially motivated objects and environments designed to be as convincing to us as possible, the race for suggesting the most reality-convincing experience is on. Companies are racing for a head start in the game of defining the near future real, with neurofitted graphics and sophisticated technological methods of virtual world making, and immersive specialities of algorithmic high speeds that are promiscuously designed to cure us, enhance our capabilities, make our work lives more efficient, our networked encounters more present, or for the sake of entertaining us in addictive and highly profitable immersive games and movie experiences. So consequently, what seems real to us has come to depend on the extent to which we are being convinced of its reality. To approach art in perspective of this narrative of our current technological perceptual condition, I engage a technogenetic perspective with reference to the works of, among others, Catherine Hales, Catherine Malabou, and Bernard Stiegler. A technogenetic perspective considers how digital expanded reality experiences are not only representations of images or environments that we can see, navigate, and interpret, but are also implicated with our biological and deep cultural human processes of changing with technology. The technogenetic perspective embraces implications of technologically influenced perceptual experience through intuitive, habitual functions of memory and emotions, and down to the mechanisms of biological and neurosensory patterns that support these. My focus in this paper is on a tendency that seems to guide the design of digital expanded realities today, which is to offer experiences that we easily cope with, disappear in, heal from, find pleasure in, or advance ourselves with. Experiences that are perceptually fitted to our nervous systems, our sensorial faculties, and our selective mechanisms. And these experiences seem to intuitively or scientifically derive from studies on how the brain and human sensorial system works, which I will return to. My analytical protagonist in the paper is the figure and phenomenon of the mirror, which embodies a motive to represent, alter, or challenge a human relation to what is perceived to be reality. At least since Plato describes Socrates' account of art as an imitative representation of nature in the Republic, the mirror has been associated with mimesis, representation, and revelation, and cast as an objective reflector of the world, but also as a protagonist in an ongoing negotiation between truth and artifice. The mirror has operated through urban architectural features since modernity and later through screens and media architecture, evoking elusive and deceptive mechanisms of perception. This motive of mimetic production has been of concern to the Marxist critical theorists for decades, concerned with how we mirror ourselves in our own cultural fabrications. But the mirror is particularly interesting to my inquiry here in perspective of its recent recurrence in the biological and as a design principle for cueing perception to mutate in reflection of cultural and neurosensory pathways that we already know. The mirror, as a motive of mimetic production, accompanies design practices for especially optical innovation. And I will just delve for a moment on these technogenetic aspects of how the mimetic mirror motive is engaged in science and especially in optical innovation, since from here we might come to better understand and challenge the motive's operation in the arts. That is, when the art experience is created to mirror the experience in us by aligning it or parts of it with our neurosensory systems and expectations. Since mirror neurons were discovered in the brain and human sensorial system in the 1990s, neural pathways have been measured and the behaviors mirrored in algorithms of graphics and visual design to create experiences that affect the sensory system of the experiencing subject in a particular manner. Mirror neurons function as a natural mechanism in the human neurosensory system, whereby we naturally default to what we have done before or to things that we have familiarity with. This can be explained by an autopilot mechanism in the brain known as the neural path of least resistance, whereby in order to save energy and act efficiently, the brain tends to make neural connections of familiarity. The neural mechanisms behind this can be explained from the principle of Hebb's law with the principle that neuronal cells that fire together wire together. So the theory is that once neural networks are formed, they are prone to repetition. And this can explain synaptic plasticity, the adaptation of brain neurons during learning processes, which are activated during, for example, recovery treatment. And hence, perceptual experiences change the possibility of synapses, the basis on which new neurons are born, which is what is referred to as neurogenesis, the fact that our neural networks are undergoing regular morphological and functional. The path of least resistance extends to become a design principle in the creation of graphic and visual sensorial experiences that are designed for us to easily learn a new task, recover or enhance an ability. And the goal here might be one of healing us, like in this case, soldiers recovering from PTSD by reliving their traumas. It might be one of seducing us, of optimizing our performative capacities, or of providing a strong, effective experience. When a graphic image or environment is designed to stimulate our brain pathways and align with already existing images or patterns, what is presented to us becomes more convincing or more effective in terms of the goal it is designed to achieve. But when design principles evolve from a motivation of extending our senses rather than going against them, they indirectly celebrate the smoothest path and the ideal healthy brain rather than its creative activation, a tendency that Catherine Malabou addresses in What Shall We Do With Our Brains? And this fertilizes a reductive tunnel towards more linear, universal and neurofitted reality fabrications in which we end up reflecting art and ourselves. Our cultural selves are rooted in our biological foundations, just like neuronal functioning and social functioning mutually give each other form. The mirror motive that has underpinned practices of measurement, analysis and sense-making is one by which the mirror is treated as somewhat intact according to the worldview or scientific paradigm engaged, or according to the pre-assumed capabilities of the experiencing subject. The logic behind this assumes a sense of mirrored compatibility between those who experience and that which they experience, between a generalized sensorial system of perception and art as a representative of objects and impressions in the world. We practice this blindness when, for example, we confidently articulate what an artwork will make you feel, or how an art project or experience will have certain effects on or award the people participating. From such assumptions, we have trained ourselves to extract meaning from art's analysis and identify an effective outcome or sense of production of the art experience. But I propose that, instead of searching for the mimetic mirror motive that celebrates the smooth path of least perceptual resistance, that we search for an alternative mirror motive in art, one that is broken. In art and literature, scholars have widely examined the occurrence of the mirror as both an object and concept of perception, reflecting different modes of vision. The mirror has been related to modern experience, introducing the internal awareness of the external eye on the self. Dynamics of mirror vision have been examined in relation to subjectivity and self-reflexivity, and the mirror has also been a protagonist of investigations of intersubjectivity among art spectators, to name just a few of these investigations. The mirror has significantly been used as a motive, metaphor, and tool to challenge and alter certain modes of vision, notably through investigations into visual perceptual premises of the experiencing subjects, oftentimes the artist's, relation to reality. For the late 19th century avant-garde artists, the mirror became a symbol of self-referentiality, a mechanism of mutability of perception rather than an imitative capacity in art. And ideas of exposing conceptual instabilities and destabilizing coherencies of visual phenomena were pursued further by artists in the 20th century, for whom the mirror became a symbol of fragmented selfhood. The mirror became an emblem of fractured, unstable modes of seeing, broken rather than intact. And these capacities for inversion, mutability, and fragmentation, which the broken mirror embodies, represented a fragile threshold between art and reality rather than a smooth relation. My question that extends from here is, could the art experience of digital expanded reality today offer a re-inhabitation of the real artifice, and not only conceptually, but actually? The broken mirror continues ideas that were put forth by the avant-garde artists of the late 19th century and the 20th century, concerned with perceptual instabilities, destabilization of visual phenomena, and with fragmented selfhood and self-representation. But it also engages more deeply with the technologically challenged natures and patterns of perceptual experience today. I propose that we bring the idea of the broken mirror into contemporary purview in our analytical practices, and with this I mean that we seek beyond the conceptualization of perceptual issues as mere themes, and beyond a focus on the art as an object or experience of representation. That we explore and distinguish between different kinds of art experiences that might not be smooth, and that we acknowledge the simultaneous occurrence of different kinds of neurosensory processes and thereby leave behind the idea of a fixed, ideal subject or subjectivity. In doing so, we can search more closely for what the art experience actually does and makes possible within us and with us, which involves a close attention to the biological and emotional implications of experience that condition the cognitive and neurologically complex natures and patterns of mutability of perception today. A technogenetic perspective continues an exploration of the relevance of the idea of difference today, for example, by looking further into the physical, psychological modes of dissociation, which is something I am writing about elsewhere. And this moves the focus from art's representational relation to reality to art's facilitation of human relations to reality. And it might bring us closer to both understand and challenge how art participates in expanding our realities today. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions.
My name is Lucilia. I'm from Brazil, and I will present the paper Schizomachine, a wearable schizo-interface for a schizo-body. Our sense of schizo begins at birth when we are born. At first, we are two in one body. We grow up inside it. We listen to its sounds, a woman's body sounds. We speak to her by movements. We dance inside it. We kick it. Then we split. You are born. And so, a schizophrenic machine comes to the world. The schizophrenic machine is a concept created to describe the work in progress named Schizomachine, a wearable neurobiofeedback system project for affective aesthetic experiences. It's a conceptual and experimental proposal. As a concept, it is inspired by Silence, John Cage, and his experience in an anechoic chamber in 1951. Schizomachine is also motivated by Gimzuski and Pellin's sonocytology, a study on cell sounds developed in 2002. Another influence comes from schizophrenia, a concept coined by Canadian composer Murray Schafer in 1969 to describe the splitting of a sound from its original source, such as the case of electroacoustic reproduction. Schizophrenia is hearing a condition to our existence long before the body becomes a body. It occurs, for example, within the uterus, where the fetus listens to the mother's sounds and recognizes them, as well as to the external sounds without recognizing at first the source that produces them. The fetus not only listens to the sounds, but also vibrates with them and transfigures itself in sound. Thus, it defines its sounds a rhythmic identity. The fetus grows in the woman's body and they split at birth. It is schizo by nature, schizo-body, once it is no longer part of the mother's body. The body would be then a schizophrenic machine in whose interior affects float, a continent where the sonorous rest. Among the sounds from the outside and the ones produced within the human body, there is a zone of indiscernibility that speaks, sometimes yells in silence, but keeps histories in its cellular memories that could be told from the points of view of sound and listening. As an example, the silence experiment of American composer John Cage in an anechoic chamber at Harvard University, where he listened to his own body sounds, described as a high one from the nervous system in operation and a low one from blood in circulation. People aren't sounds, are they? Asks Cage in the book Silence. What if we could listen to the sounds of ourselves? James Gimzuski, professor at the Department of Chemistry at UCLA, and his then PhD student Andrew Pellin, professor at the University of Ottawa, got close to that with their experiment with yeast cells. Through an atomic force microscope, the researchers found out that the yeast cells oscillate in a nanoscale likely to be amplified to a range that is audible by human ear. They named this new study field sonocytology. With a simple reasoning, any vibrating object or surface produces pressure in the air around and thus emits sound. If the cells vibrate, then they must produce some sort of sound. This finding not only enhances our concept of listening, but also changes our relation with silence. If I don't hear it, does it still communicate? Asks Cage again. From the concepts of silence, sonocytology, and schizophrenia, I propose to look at the body as a schizo-body whose first identity is not a binary organization of the sexes, but rather a sonorous, rhythmic, and schizophrenic identity. A body whose vibrations, the vital signs, change according to the emotions produced in the relationships established in the daily life and the sensations triggered in the encounter with art. This is the case with blood pressure and heart rate, which accelerate depending on the intensity of emotional discharge. In this sense, We are not born man or woman, we are born sounds. Each body a sonority, each sonority an identity. We are music, therefore. I then try to answer Cage. There are many ways to listen to our body. What if we could see the sounds that we listen to, the silent sounds of our body? Would we listen to it better? Which histories would it tell us? As an experimental proposal, the Schizomachine emerged from the desire to tell this body's histories, its affective memories, from a sonorous visual experimentation with affective technologies such as biosensors, smart and textiles, and neurobiofeedback systems. I propose to explore other possibilities of listening, having the body as an object, a potential music instrument, the skin as an interface, and the sight as a listening of sight. An object in which the production of sensations, the effective potence of art, can be experienced by means of a self-affection when the subject becomes the work of art, and vice versa. Instead of looking at the artwork from the outside, one would look at it from within by getting into the machine, such as the Cage's experience in an anechoic chamber and the works by Brazilian artists Parangolé and the I and the U Clothing Body Clothing by Elio Oiticica and Ligia Clark respectively, in which the subject becomes the work of art by wearing it. As an exercise of possible listenings, the first idea of the Schizomachine, which I proposed in my PhD thesis in 2008, intended to make the inaudible of the body visible by means of a second skin, with biosensors distributed all over their clothing in order to capture the silent sounds around the body. This proposal suggested the need of some sort of sensor able to capture these subtle sonorities of the body, ideally a textile-based sensor. 10 years later, by observing the reactions of my students to contemporary art, I resumed this project, assuming that the aesthetic experience is also a communication experience. It has inspired me to investigate the sensitive universe of communication that expresses itself stoutly in an aesthetic experience, while we appreciate art in a museum, concert, cinema, art gallery, or even while walking on a beautiful city street. This first idea led to the proposal that I have been working on, also inspired by some affective wearable interfaces, such as skin dress, a Philips exploration into emotional sensing from a program called Design Probe, and Nowhere, Now Here, an interactive dress by Ingal, fashion designer and professor at University of Quebec. In order to investigate those affective states of the body, the work in progress in Schizomachine proposed to make some sensitive communication processes of the human body visible by means of mapping and monitoring methods of the subject's physiological parameters and transduction of this data into light during the artistic experience. Inspired by the first experiments in the late 60s of artists using BCI, brain-computer interface, EEG, electroencephalogram, and neural and biofeedback, such as Alvin Lucier, Richard Teitelbaum, and Nina Sobel, the Schizomachine will be initially composed of both an EEG cap named SchizoCap, which generates the input data, and a clothing with LEDs fixed to it called Schizobody, a sort of a wearable display where the data can be seen in the form of light, the output. They will be used in the context of an artistic assembly. The schizocap is comprised of 13 dry electrodes attached to a structure made by crochet and connected to 6 EEG sensors and 6 correspondent channels of the interface board made by the battalion system, which digitizes and transmits the signals via Bluetooth to a processing computer. The electrodes are distributed all on the cap according to the International 10-20 system to collect data from different areas of the brain. In the installation, the stimuli are supposed to be by the subject's own body during the experience through a passive BCI system in which the subject has no intention to control or communicate using BCI. The subject's brain will be measured without him or her being asked to voluntarily evoke a particular kind of brain activity or paying attention to external stimuli that will have an effect on brain activity, as explained I wrote in the book Brain Art. Unlike Oiticica's Parangolés and Ligia Clark's overalls, whose interaction is the subject's movement, the movement in the schizomachine is supposed to be as imperceptible as the silence or the sounds of the cells, in such a way that, on the one hand, it can reduce the production of noises and artifacts on the EEG acquisition, and on the other hand, it can promote a self-listening of one's own body. The current phase of the research involves the challenge of processing, analyzing, and mapping EEG data. A sonorous body presupposes a listening, and so the schizomachine intends to draw attention to the body through listening by proposing an exercise of possible listenings in which the affective states of the body could be listened not necessarily with the ears, but with the eyes, through a listening of sight. That implies a solitary experience of listening to oneself and seeing oneself no more as flesh, but color, light, no longer split, but resonant.
Dear ISEA participants and guests, my name is Ksenia Fedorova, and together with my colleague Elena Demidova, I'd like to share with you our presentation about experiments with sensory modalities and sensory substitution in artistic laboratories in Russia in recent years. First, the terms. What is sensory substitution? So it's basically the ability of one sense to compensate for the other. What interests us in this phenomenon is the role of art in triggering new forms of perceptual organization. Sensorial disability, although it causes practical inconvenience and can lead to social isolation and so on, is interesting epistemologically and in terms of neurobiological adaptive processes. So we all know that blind people, for instance, compensate for the loss of sight, so with acute sense of hearing or haptic abilities. The tools designed for people with disability work differently for normally abled. But still, as scientific experiments show, the functional capabilities redirect themselves. And that's a great opportunity to explore for or by media aesthetics. The emerging sensory effects are highly subjective. In this sense, they can be compared to what in philosophy is often named Qualia, a sensational quality that is not connected to the characteristics of the objects, but emerges within the experiencing subject as perceived sensations. Among the critical questions then are, how exactly do these sensorial changes register in our consciousness? So how do we become aware of them? And then more importantly, even how do we communicate them? The research field of sensory substitution, starting from the neuroscientific insights by Paul Bach-y-Rita, the American neuroscientist in the 70s, has provided many insights into how certain brain functions can compensate for the others, and thus demonstrating the brain capability for plasticity. Bahirita's first device, tactile vision substitution systems, was a static assemblage consisting of a dental chair and the camera, where the images from the camera were transmitted in a form of vibratory and electric signals to the back of a person with vision deficiency. And according to the scientist, after some training, a number of blind participants were able to have image-like sensations and be able to actually navigate in space. His later innovation, BrainPort, developed in the 90s, famously allowed to generate image-like sensations by stimulating receptors on the tongue, while a wearable camera attached to the special glasses would allow bodily mobility. Today, there exists a plethora of adaptive devices designed for people with sensory disabilities of all kinds that similarly rely on the principles of neuroplasticity. So why are artists interested in sensory substitution technologies, trying to express themselves in language of touch or aroma, translating sound into visual information and vice versa? Interfaces with multisensorial engagement give artists an opportunity to create shifts in habitual types of perception, and with that to produce new artistic messages, increasingly tactile, flavored, associated with neural signals, personally encoded, and coming to us through various sensorial channels. One of the most intriguing questions that motivates the artists is the creation of new phenomena in the zones in between the known sensory modalities. Media art has always been particularly keen on experimenting with forms of communication and perception. So, and here are examples of Stellark, of Steve Mann experimenting with augmentation of vision, early experiments with EEG signals, yes, translating brain signals into sound, for instance. So, but how to treat what escapes direct translation? How to mobilize the brain capacity to create new meanings? Unlike practical applications which pursue precision, for instance, these adaptive devices for people with disabilities, artistic approach invites more ambiguity and gives room for intuitive and subjective interpretations. In Russia, interest in sensory perception and the search for alternative forms of language goes back to the avant-garde innovations of the 1910s and 20s, namely to fascination of the futurist artists and poets like Malevich or Mikhail Matushin or Alexei Kruchonych, with the qualities of pure color, light, geometrical shapes, acoustic qualities, and material textures. In the 70s and 90s, artist, inventor, and philosopher Bulat Galeev, the founder of the Prometheus Institute in Kazan, conducted extensive research on synesthesia, experimenting with analog devices and observing the resulting psychological effects. Interest to optical experiments was also characteristic to nonconformist art of the 70s. For instance, in the practices of kinetic art group Движение movement, where the junctions between the visible and the invisible could also have political underpinnings. Since the 2000s, the heritage of the avant-garde and the nonconformist art, as well as a type of poetics and the intersection of word, image, sound, space, and movement, have been explored in exhibitions curated by such diverse figures as, for instance, Vitaly Patsukov and his projects, or Olga Shishko, or quite recently also Katya Bachevar, to name just a few. Also in many museums, like the Garage Museum or Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts, there are now quite interesting inclusivity programs that are designed not just for people with disabilities, but also for the general public to raise awareness of the broader, of the diversity in perceptual abilities.
Здравствуйте, я Елена Демидова, художник и куратор лабораторий, связанных с медиакоммуникацией.
Today, more and more often, the artists turn to the experience of perception when the perception method gets to be the main part of the artistic statement, when the perception channel influences the context of received information. When there is a large amount of such channels, there is a step to the creation of sensoric world picture. In this way, Ekaterina Isaeva suggested to haptically sense the palindrome poem by Russian poet Valery Brusov, Visions of the Past. This is a deep work if you look at it from the point of view of neuroplasticity and perceptual experiments. Ekaterina made an intersemiotic translation of the poem. The lines of the poem are sequentially translated into tactile sensations that can be experienced by touching the contents of several flasks filled with grass, earth, tree bark, moss, and sand. The visitors read the lines and touched the semantically similar textures, correlating the sensations in their mind. What she found was the gap between the values of sensory systems, between feeling and naming. After all, if we sense the textures that contradict the name of the sensation we hear in the poem, for instance, we hear warm and soft and feel something cold and hard, then at some point we can get to a new type of language, a new meaning emerging directly from the interconnections within our neural library. We also experimented with haptic perception, particularly in the art science project Tactile Communicator. We imagined how we can perceive the slightest nuances of touch, the shades of what is said by touch, tactile intonation. The communicator consisted of two devices that involved a touch panel and retractable segments for a tactile response, which was supposed to be read by touch, touching with the palm. Two people could send their own tactile messages and receive them remotely. The haptic signal could be transmitted via Bluetooth to a device in another room or via a cloud server to any part of the world. Another group of students created a tactile art object based on this approach, an enlarged 6-point braille font, so that a person could read the letters of the font not with their fingertips, but with the palm of their hand. In this 6-dot pattern, you could read all the letters in braille by touch, which were made up of extendable segments in large dots in braille. Students put the phrase "do not touch" in the work program, deliberately raising the question of the borders that divide the world of the blind and the sighted. Another point in the study of tactile messages is illustrated by the work by Max Kholmykov, Acupuncture by Sound, in which the artist associated the sound signal with a tactile response. Based on the pitch, the artist sonified the intensity of the movement of the needles, so it was made possible to feel the sound by touching the surface of the box and feeling the light touch of the needles. This experience demonstrates that it is impossible to simply translate verbal information into tactile information. This language has its own laws, its own time limitations. What happens then if the coded messages refer to acoustic perception and yet are sensed in a different way, for instance, once again through touch? The tactile macro dance floor by sound artist Oleg Makarov inquires into the reaction to sound transmitted through touch. The work is a panel with low-power vibrating emitters run by a microcomputer, which generates rhythmical musical compositions. The vibration signal should be perceived by all fingers at once, and the brain then organizes this distributed information into a polyphonic whole. The object thus allows to experience the volumetric dimension of touch. This is a new experience for a human, especially for a hearing impaired or a deaf-blind. Sensory substitution and the discourse of inclusivity becomes a new context for both practical and artistic applications of technologies translating visual images into sound. Experiments in this field in Russia were famously conducted already by Alexander Scriabin, then in the 30s by engineer and inventor Evgeny Shalpo, composer Evgeny Avramov, and their colleague cinematographers interested in production of synthesized sound effects through drone sound. In the 70s, these ideas were revived by Evgeny Murzin in his photoelectronic optical synthesizer Anna S. Alexander Nikolaevich Scriabin. In the 90s, an algorithm for digital translation of a black and white image into sound was invented. And this became the basis for a sensory substitution device produced by a Moscow-based technological startup, Voice Vision, which is audio goggles that enable the blind to orient in the visual field, deciphering the stream of sounds. In parallel to Voice Vision, and inspired by her own interpretation of Evgeny Murzin's technology of optical sound, a young artist, Maria Molokova, created a work called Optical Hearing in 2019. The visitor here enters a darkened room with abstract drawings on the walls that work as sound murals. To hear them, you need to wear an optical prosthesis, a device based on Brusin's technology that captures the visual signals from the web camera and converts them into sound. The program scans the image as a sonogram, identifying brightness level and location of each pixel. The volume is dependent on brightness, so that the darkest spots turn into silence and the lightest one into loud sound. The pitch is determined by the location of the vertical line. And already in several minutes, a person starts to navigate the space, first through the big sound spots and then gradually identifying more and more nuanced messages. These experiences, where hearing or seeing is substituted with touch or any other ways, may feel as plunging into the worlds of people with vision or hearing impairments, which can lead to several conclusions. Firstly, the abilities to orient in the world, for instance, only haptically, are incredibly sharpened by practice, especially at the beginning. There is a potential that these abilities of touch and haptic sensation more generally will become finer and more detailed with both knowledge and practice that people collectively accumulate. Furthermore, as Mark Patterson notes, there is room for exploring and conceptualizing something that he names haptic imaginary, building up on the term by Jonathan Storm, sonic imaginary, an amalgam of the subtle qualia based on haptic or sonic sensations. Secondly, the development of haptic or any other sensory ability involves reproducibility of experiences. Common between Braille code and the algorithms behind optical sound synthesizers that we've talked about, or haptic instruments developed by the artists like Makarov or Kalmykov, is the presence of certain denotational rules, like this stands for that. The more precise these rules are, the more they function like a language, with individual elements forming syntagmas, the basic units of meaning. Imagined by artists, these codes can be potentially endless. They are self-contained and cannot be used for communication with others like normal languages are, but rather their value lies in expanding the perceptual apparatus and with that the capacity to receive hidden messages, however abstract, multi-ciphered and even paradoxical they may be. Unexpected combinations of the types of code, medium, message lead to a temporary formation in the brain of new qualia, subjective feelings of the new, even if elusive, objects of reality. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a sentient difference, body sensory modalities. I am Anna Peraica. I'm going to moderate this. Present you our presenters. We are here with Tanya Ravn Ag. She's a curator and postdoc at Copenhagen University. She also serves as ISEA advisory board member. Here with us is also Maria Lucilia Borges, assistant professor of Federal University of Printemps, and Ksenia Fedorova. She's a lecturer at the university. She collaborated with Elena at University. I would like first to ask some questions to our presenters and then somehow try to communicate some general issues together with them, and at the end maybe have some questions from the audience. So as we are having, I think it's going to be enough so that we can unveil some very important issues which are related to human body sensory modalities as theme of this session. So first, talk a little bit to Tanya. She presented a paper, a presentation on Art and Broken Mirror, a technogenic perspective on digital expanded reality. So, Tanya, I really find it very interesting. I was also reading the history of mirrors, and actually the history of mirrors writing a book on selfies. And there I actually learned how the mirrors were evolving and developed through the history and conditioning the visuality and what we know as art history, and also the reference we have. I would like to put which is related to mirrors. Do you include in your paradigm of a broken mirror also concave and convex mirrors? Is it working as a plural metaphor, or is it really related only to something that we use today and we implement today, the flat mirroring system as we know it?
Unfortunately, I missed a part of your question, but I think I got the last part, so I'll try to answer. It was a sound discrepancy. So I think the point I wish to emphasize with the broken mirror, or that I wish to suggest, is that I think there can be a tendency of seeking to smooth out experience, or to how can we say, make a aesthetic experience in art and elsewhere compatible with our neurosensory systems and our bodily systems, in order to convince us that the experience is somehow real, or it's authentic, or it is something that that we can how can you say bodily adapt to. So the broken mirror is then, as I think you also mentioned, a concept building on art history, and a long trajectory of seeking of working with fragmented selfhood and fragmentation of the self, but trying to bring a technogenetic perspective into that, meaning bring into how can you say continue that line of thinking with how technologies are actually fragmenting our selfhood today, or how they're reworking our sense of perception. So the broken mirror, as I've worked with it in my paper, is mostly a concept to seek to challenge the idea of the mirror as just mimesis in that understanding, and to seek to work in concepts that could perhaps extend these ideas from the avant-garde. For example, we could bring in a concept like dissociation. What does it mean to dissociate yourself from an experience rather than immersively, smoothly integrating yourself in the experience? And I don't speak as an artist, so I cannot speak from a perspective of artistic production, but I think that as a theoretician and an analyst, there's something to look for that is different if we are not primarily looking at how the experience is integrating us in something that is intended, and rather look at how we're actually becoming dissociated, or invited to experience dissociation from the experience.
Then that follows another question, which is related again to history of mirrors. Mirrors have been quite mystified during the history. Even today on the Balkans, if you break the mirror, you are being threatened that you're going to have 7 years of unluck, for example. Or there is some kind of magical attribution during the medieval ages in which possessing a mirror was problematic, and the witches were blamed or burned for possessing something that was a mirror. Is there a magic aspect to this kind of reality which is being emerged in the technical mirroring?
I think that could be a very interesting trajectory to pursue. I haven't looked at the history of magic, but I think that's very interesting. And regardless, I think that the idea of a mirror of being broken means that it is not perfect, it is not smooth, the surface is somehow damaged. It also means that when we use the mirror as a metaphor for how our perception works or operates today, and how art can work with our perception today, then we are dealing with something that is not perfect. It's not the ideal human being. It's not the optimized human being. And I'm leaning a little bit on the thoughts of Catherine Malabou here, and her critique of the sort of idealized idea of the brain, for example. So I think there could be something to get from the history of mysticism, which I will admit I have to study further. But certainly the broken mirror speaks to something that is not, it's not in the front line of how do you say, how civilization in an optimized, ideal, industrialized, hyper-industrialized way might want to present themselves. Maybe it's digging more into the dark roots, the dark champers that are in the back of our neurosensory systems, and also that that touch upon the dark sides of being human, like a concept like dissociation that I mentioned before. It's not very pleasant. I've tried it myself after an experience. I was completely dissociated from my reality. I had a hard time to reintegrate into reality in a sense, and it was very painful. So I think it definitely opens up for some of the more complex sides of human experience.
Yeah, and then very interesting experience is also the experience through this kind of process of mirroring. The sense of self. You experience yourself.
I'm sorry, Anna. I couldn't hear.
So it is also how you experience yourself in the same process.
Yes, I was in contact with an ancient dark mysticism, but I experienced it to be quite painful. And it's I think the broken mirror as a concept that I extend to and it's becoming an artistic concept. I think it very much allows for addressing those aspects of experience that are not pleasant, that are not ideal, that are not optimized, because that's also what experience is. And that's also how, if we look at art and how art provides us with experiences that are somehow useful for our humanity, or that somehow push us further or help us integrate with what it means to exist today, I think those experiences are very valuable.
Yeah. So then that brings us deeper of philosophy. She's also speaking of the experience of self. Somehow more because it's schizoid, but it's very to writings of still, is it really the impact of Guattari in Brazil is really strong, and is it related to your research, his writings in particular?
I did not hear you. Sorry. Could you repeat?
So I would is Guattari's presence in Brazil really fundamental for your research?
Yes. I didn't understand the whole question, but I heard the last part about Guattari. Yes. I use, my background is mainly semiotics and Deleuze and Guattari, and especially Deleuze and Guattari philosophy are present in my research, and they helped me to construct this concept of schizophrenic machine.
Yeah, and then Guattari, his philosophy, he writes that as a child he was a little bit broken on the edges, which I think brings us really to Tanya's writing. That's the way he defines this schizoid personality, by defining the brokenness. And how you actually do you actually see the problem of this double binding in the relationship of outside and inside reality that you are trying to somehow combine with your schizomachine?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first?
How do you define the inner and outside reality with the schizoid machine, with the schizomachine? Have you heard me well? The relationship between inside and outside reality. Doesn't work.
Yes. How can I combine the inside and the outside of this schizophrenic machine? First, I started to think about to design, to create this idea from the outside as thinking about the relationship between music and design and seeing this relationship separated, and then looking at how these two universes could mix it. And then I was looking at some artworks that could express examples, some concepts that I was working on in my research. So I started to look at the objects, something that is outside of the body, and as an object, as an artwork, and the human being as a spectator, or just looking at the experience the artwork, just looking at it or listen to or interacting with this. But then I thought that this relation to build this idea of the schizophrenic machine would be more than the separate artwork and the spectator, not mixing them, just interacting as when you are in a space, for example, in a sound art space, that you have to do something and to interact to the artwork. But I would put the subject, the spectator, in a place that he or she would be more focused in him or herself, bring to the spectator almost like a meditation experience, and call the attention to the body. And so I start from looking at the objects and thinking, trying to build this idea of schizophrenic machine as an object or an art installation. And then I arrived to the body, and I was looking to the body, and through this Genzuski and Pelling sonocytology, I thought, oh, it would be amazing if we could listen to our own sounds. That's how I mixed these two ideas, the inside and the outside. And I guess this, as an wearable interface, I could bring this idea to the spectator once he or she would become the artwork, because the Schizomachine itself is nothing if there is nobody wearing it. So it is only work when someone wears it. You know, I guess I answered your question.
You have. But it also looks like very practical somehow, because also in your presentation, there is this proposal for using it in a gallery space. So it can also be used, and it's very useful in certain situations, for example, in audience analysis, in perception studies. So not really like only an artistic proposal that is having a certain kind of heuristic tendency, but also there is an possible implementation and utilitarian aspect of this proposal.
I can see all the applications for this proposal, but I propose the artwork and to test this a wearable interface in an artistic context because I observed some neuroscience research related to emotions. And when you are doing a test, an experiment in a lab, neuroscience lab, the subject knows that he or she are a subject of an experiment. And what would happen if we change this, if we bring the lab to the museum, or using the museum and the art gallery as a laboratory. That's the center of my research, is that. Because we have a lot of caps and a lot of EEG caps and BCIs and wearable interfaces. But what I am proposing is to see what would happen if we could capture and record this data, biodata, in a museum. My hypothesis is that we could maybe capture some more interesting signs, signals, and other different emotional signals, which I call sensation to different. I call about sensation and emotions, daily emotions, because it's different when we are experiencing art. That emotion that we feel when we are listening to music, for example, in a concert, is different from the emotions that we experience in the daily life, you know?
Yeah. That brings us back to Tanya's aspect of fragmentation in mirror. Do you see the relationship somehow to your presentation in this?
Yes, well, I definitely think now. I just I had a phrase that you just mentioned, Lucille, got stuck with me. This the connection of the relationship between emotions that we experience in the museum or with art and in daily life. In my research and also in this paper, I really stress that the sensorial experience we work with or produce or examine in art is not, hopefully it's different than from what we just experience in our everyday life, but we can say our conditions for experiencing them, our sort of pre-coded perceptual entering into the experience is the same as that with which we encounter experiences in everyday life. So I think it's very important that we and especially with media art, because when you work with media aesthetics and you work with media systems, recording systems, systems exposing us to all kinds of media aesthetics today, you work with something that is, you can say, governing and structuring our contemporaneity. That's our condition for communicating with each other and for existing. So I think we always have to see the experience with art as not something that can be isolated and idealized, which I'm critiquing that there is a tendency to do. We fix it in a representation, in the ideal mode of what the art is supposed to do or what the concept is behind it, and then we hope the audience kind of gets it. We cannot do that. We really have to look at art as experiences that have a place among all the experiences we have in our contemporaneity, and we have to look at the perceiver or the participant, the audience, as someone who's also a participant in everyday life. So that was something you said, Lucille, that stuck with me, that kicked that. But I don't know if that was your question, Anna.
Yeah, that was my question, and actually I wanted to say something, Lucille.
In the papers I read about the emotions, they don't use, for example, as I'm using sensation and emotion to be in two places different, but they call spontaneous emotions, and spontaneous emotions, I guess, is what I'm saying, sensations. But of course, it can happen. This sensation experience or this art experience, it can occur all the time, even when while we are walking in a beautiful street, for example. It's not something that is really related to the art. I don't need exact to be in a museum to feel that thing, you know. But in terms of experiments, emotional experiments, I guess to capture more interesting signals, I guess, or you should build a place in the lab, the neuroscience lab, that could bring this art experience to the lab, instead of just put the electrodes in the heads and recorded the signals and ask to the person, do this, do that, you know. Would be more interesting if they could build a lab more artistic, or like an art exhibition in the lab, or do the opposite, use the lab, the museum or art gallery as a lab to record signals. But I don't know how to do this in ethical terms, how to do this without the audience know that they are actually being a subject of an experiment, because my point is, if the person knows that he or she is a subject, she's doing an experiment, it could repress some emotions, I guess. But I agree, we don't need to, this experience can happen all the time. It's not something exactly related to art, but if we are researching emotions, and if we plan to record signals, emotional signals, that's my point. I don't. Is it clear?
Yes. Yeah. That actually brings us to Ksenia, who gave a really good overview of the research. And now the question is if the integration in art and science and also life in general was efficient during the time these experiments were started.
Well, hi again, everyone. First of all, I'm not exactly sure what you mean, Anna. So how the relations between art and science were in mind?
What these experiments you were overviewing, were they solitary? Were they somehow excluded from environment in terms of science as well and arts, or have they stayed alone as alone experiments, or they had the continuity in a certain kind of environment in which they were evolving and happening?
I see. Yeah, well, here I must clarify, first of all, that in the title, indeed, we have the word experiment as opposed to, let's say, artworks. But it's not a scientific experiment that is implied here. It's rather that my colleague Elena Demidova, so who was leading mostly those laboratories, workshops rather, so she works at Polytechnical University, where she teaches basically engineers so to do creative projects, so leading innovation, so through creativity. So, and what they do, so maybe, so I was just doubting myself, so whether we can call those pieces artworks, especially done by those students, and experiment in the sense of, well, all artists usually have this stage of pure experimentation, of playing with ideas, with new instruments, with languages they're still developing, right? And in this sense, so yes, we just wanted to share these experiences of experiments. And in terms of engagement of science, so yes, it's interesting to think about that as a background, of course, and well, partly my interest for this whole topic of sensory substitution is, of course, informed by developments in neuroscience, so neuroplasticity research and so on. So it wasn't studied in this case, so from that perspective, so there were not no scientists involved, so observing how exactly the people would be reacting and what exactly is happening in the brain, especially. So you could see, so yes, indeed, they were, well, not really solitary, but so just normal art kind of gallery experiences. So if that answers. Actually, I also had a few maybe comments to the previous discussion, but also we have a few questions in the from the audience in the chat. So maybe we could all those.
Yeah, there are questions in the audience. There are a question for Tanya. Do you think that the computer simulation as a metaphor of broken mirror is
that depends on the computer simulation, I think. So let me see, I'm just reading the question again. If it results in the fragmentation of human perception in contemporaneity. I think there's a tendency for computer simulations today to maybe not result from fragmentation of perception, but rather seeking perhaps to make it easy for human perception to interpret and immerse oneself into what is being simulated. And of course, we would need some examples here to kind of discuss this properly. But I don't know if maybe I misunderstand the question, but I don't know if I follow the computer simulation as a metaphor of the broken mirror. It would be perhaps if the computer simulation somehow invited the experiencing people to explore something that is how can I say that is not linear, that's something that evokes confusion, something that takes fragmentation of selfhood seriously in perspective of our technical contemporaneity today. And that would definitely be possible, but it depends on how it operates.
Yeah, then we have a second question from Rachel. She asked if, how do you approach archiving and documentation of these sensorial works where experiencing the artwork is individual and activated by each user? Maybe you have any experiences and methods, especially now during the pandemic, we view, learn, and experience art through documentation, how to deal with these kinds of artworks.
I may jump to that because this is something that interests me actually in parallel to, well, this particular research. So, and I frame it not even as a question of documentation, of archiving, but kind of mapping. Yeah, so what exactly happens? And it does deal even with the question of this particular paper, so what is missing in translation. For instance, there have been such attempts even since the early 2000s in media art by what's his name, Reinhard. Forgot the first name, but it doesn't matter. So. And it's creating a whole software so to mark particular points of an installation, so image, sound, behavior of the participant, and so on, and that becomes a work of its own, right? So that software, the meta work on top of the experience of a work. But on the other hand, I've been interested in issues of diagrammatics, for instance. So how do we describe so what exactly is happening? And maybe it is described through, well, metaphors, or if it's visual language used, so also in some creative way you can not exactly document, yes, so like it won't be a mirror, right, an exact representation of what happened, or documentation in a classical sense, and yet some interpretation that may still open more useful insights to what exactly was happening, or even interviews. So that is also always a productive tool, I think, in relation to such subjective experiences. But I agree, it is a challenge indeed.
Yeah. Now, actually, we are coming to fragmentary experience of the coronavirus. So then the next question is from Stefan Palito. He asks, Ksenia, can you please reflect on the issue of the arbitrary nature of the artist's decisions in design, theory, or substitution? Any insights on intuitive substitutions that benefit from the already established neural pathways?
Yeah, interesting. Well, the whole point of these particular experiments and reflections about them is to think about so what is the conventional, yes, so the established neural pathways that, well, as it happens, so we realize that they even exist only when we step back, right? So step aside from them, and actually what all of us are talking about here, yes, so with broken mirrors or with schizo experiences, yes, so again, so this awareness of difference. So, and the arbitrariness, yeah, I agree that well, artists may have their inspiration from any kind of aspects of reality, right? So, and be it smell, yeah, or some other manifestation, it doesn't really matter unless it can resonate, it can be put in some framework where it can start making new sense, right? So the whole point here for us was to just explore these connections and disconnections between different modalities, and but also different messages. So yeah, and in that sense, so building on the existing neural pathways is good because, well, they already work, but at the same time exploring what is not yet that well. So these brain connections, yeah, so between sound or vision, so that for blind people, for instance, are totally different than for, or let's say not fully blind, yes, but with vision disabilities of some sort, so they compensate in a different way than normally abled people, and there is a lot to learn from those ways of being in the world.
And then you have one more question, and it is, how do you think does the divergence between visible and invisible affect art?
I didn't hear the end, but I remember reading that question. So about the political, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And well, and sorry, and the first part was Is that?
How is that? So it's invisible
Yes.
aspect. Yeah.
Yes, I appreciate the question very much. So because indeed it has a political dimension here, exactly because of this invisibility of difference, of an alternative. And so when we study these subjective experiences, and well, as all of us again are talking about that, the internal, right? So that you may not even know that yourself well enough unless you really listen, right? Concentrate, become aware of that. And well, of course, the role of art has always been to create these experiences of attention to something, yes, so becoming more aware, acute, and so on. Yeah, the political here is also this attention to difference of well, between different experiences, yes, so different subjective ways of being in the world that may be invisible.
It's also in Lucilia, in her definition of the body as the interface. It's actually the political definition, isn't it?
Yes, somehow.
Yeah.
And
you're negotiating, yeah.
Yes, and the political, and also a kind of feminist as well, because and being, I wouldn't say that I am feminist, but this idea is feminist. This view, this point of view of the body as a schizo-body, because we should look at this point more carefully, that we are not a binary organization of the sexes, you know, as would say Deleuze and Guattari. If we see, look at the body in this point of view as a sonorous body, we will see that actually we are sounds, we are music, even before we have a body, when we are just a cell. So this is a kind of a political act of this little cell when it's inside the human's body. I am not man, I will not be a man or a woman, I am sound, you know. That's my view.
Yeah, but some senses, yeah, sorry, Ksenia.
Yeah, well, I just want to comment also on what Hanna, you said, so about the body as an interface, because I've been also working on this concept of interfaciality. Actually, just published a book, Tactics of Interfacing, which may sound political, although it's not only. So it's about the affective dimension also, but indeed, so art is always already an interface. But it's also political or ethical in a sense that it's about establishing a connection to that other in you, and also inviting the other to well, explore you, for instance, start caring about you in some way, like in those pieces by Lydia Clark that you showed, from the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And it also brings us to somehow, we are having 5 minutes more, so I'm going to try to somehow bring our discussion kind of central place. When we are speaking about senses, when we are speaking about sensorial data, and taking into account, has been really a lot written in philosophy on relativist positions in sense data, like still nowadays. We are always tending to compare senses somehow, and also try to translate one sense into the other. There are completely different spatial descriptions we are getting from our senses. Like some things seem nearer and some seem very far in spatial descriptions regarding to our senses. And in the time of the isolation now and this coronavirus, in the times in which our bodies are being how do we find the role of the senses, we get through them is going on, and how are we going to experience the world in such a distance that we are being inserted into? Anyone?
You post at the end?
Yeah, you like something?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
You didn't hear it. So
no, just the questions at the end.
At the end, yes. The thing is, I wanted just to relate it to the situation right now with this coronavirus, which is distancing the bodies, one body from another, and in which we are actually finding completely different sensorial input, and in which we are going to rely on some other information in order to understand and in order to learn the reality.
I could say something to that. I think it's quite crucial at the moment with social isolation, lockdown, etc. I think it's quite crucial that that especially art explores how to create sensorial experiences that are truly hybrid and that can connect people without necessarily having to be in the same space, because I think it's exactly that. A capacity that art has is to create a space where we can share or experience a kind of shared sense of realness. So here I'm thinking also of Hannah Arendt and her discussions of realness and versus irreality. So I think it's actually a big task at the moment, where we used to come to the spaces of art to experience something together in some kind of relational way, and right now I see a lot of artists experimenting with how to create these experiences online, being streamed or not necessarily visual but sensorial experience. I think it's really crucial at the moment, but how it can be done, that's of course the questions. I think some of the most powerful experiences I've encountered has been, I'm thinking of the Swedish artist Lundahl and Seidel, for example. They have a piece called A Missing Room, which is a sound, an app that you download and then you explore it to people in your own living room, but in your sort of interpersonal experience there, you also connect to others experiencing it where they are, but it's very immersive and it's purely sound. So yeah. I think that's a great task for art at the moment, and I think that I spoke a little bit about technogenesis, and that is our technogenesis is being affected by the current conditions. So we need a different kind of sensorial stimuli to recover.
Lucille, what do you say about this situation? We are closing. We are having only a couple of minutes now, so we need to be really short.
Oh my God, I don't. I just would exemplify using. There is an institute in Brazil that they are promoting lives at Instagram, and they are artists doing their performances in their home. And this is an amazing experience, because we can see in your cell phone or computer or whatever, and they could get this sense of immersion with simple things like just an actor and a camera, or sometimes the actor is walking in his or her home. And so art in Brazil, and these, especially these lives of Sesc São Paulo, they are saving our life in this pandemic.
Yeah. Ksenia.
I would just say, would second Tanya, especially on the aspect of presence. So what is important is maybe to design, well, or come up artistically with these frameworks for maybe not sharing the same space, yes, but at least the same time, and yeah, and share this other reality, so to say. So what art maybe invites us to experience, think about, feel more something about oneself, but also maybe to do it less with screens and rather finding other types of connections between human bodies. So, but in the same time, so live.
Yeah.
And with that, I guess we should say goodbye to our time of being present.
So thank you very much for your participation, your great papers, and I think now for next informal communication about these topics we just opened. I think the time has passed so quickly, and